I meet a man that works for the Sinaloa Cartel. And eventually I gave in to the invitations to start drug trafficking for them and worked for the cartel, and eventually quit working for the cartel, and then got convinced to go back and do one last run. That was, of course, a setup. And so I get busted by the Mexican military, and I get thrown in jail for what threatens to be a 10 to 25-year sentence.
Welcome to another episode of Entrepreneurs in Recovery. I'm your host, Jesse Harless. This is a podcast where we explore the amazing stories of resilience. We also explore the world of entrepreneurship. We explore the world of the healing potential of psychedelics and much more. So thank you for tuning into today's show. And if you're listening to this show for the first time, welcome. If you're listening to it maybe the third or 50th time, and I just found out today I had someone from my past, maybe of 16, 17 years ago, through another friend, share that they've been listening to every episode. We're in this episode today, I believe, is number 79. So amazing. I'm always blown away by hearing people in the past listening to this show. So thank you. If you're listening to the show, go onto YouTube, like and subscribe to the show. You can watch the video of these interviews. And if you're on Spotify, iTunes, if you wouldn't mind leaving me a review, that helps more guests to find the show. And we have a lot of great guests coming up, really amazing people. So thank you so much. Also, thank you for checking out my work I'm doing with the psychedelic experience curation or psychedelic concierge work. That's starting to catch some fire in its own right. And I'm starting to talk to some people to work with and help them to really find an experience that embodies safety, integration as they explore the world of psychedelics. So thank you for that as well. So today's guest is Jeffrey Sorensen. And Jeffrey is the founder of Breath Army. And we have such a grounded conversation today, so grounded that I felt like at some stages of the conversation, I was doing my own little meditation as I was talking to him, because the conversation was meditative. And it was also very spicy in many ways in the sense of his content and what he has gone through in his story. And I really am going to save, you need to just listen to the whole episode. But Jeff has been through quite a bit, going to jail, getting mixed up with the cartel, so many things in this, but a really fascinating journey into cold therapy and the breath and much, much more. So tune into this show. Welcome. Thank you so much for listening. Enjoy. Hey, Jeff, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on, Jesse. Good to be here.
Yeah. And we were just talking a little bit about the east side and west side of Canada. And I never thought of that before. I know in the United States, like I was just mentioning, I was born in 1983. So you had the East Coast, West Coast beef with rap. And I was just thinking about Canada and like, what was that like? Canada on the east side and west side. But from what I can understand, it probably wasn't the same. But there's definitely distinct differences, it sounds like, between the east and the west side of Canada and the culture.
Yeah, I would say that the kind of the rap battle in Canada has been with Quebec, kind of historically, and definitely different cultures throughout Canada and the French speaking and English speaking. And the English kind of trying to take over Quebec has definitely caused a rift that is that's still present.
Yeah, this is all fascinating. You just don't, when you grew up in America, you don't really think about Canada and the sides and the culture. And I didn't travel to Canada at all until later in life. And so, yeah, it makes me think of that. And you're in what, Revelstoke?
I'm in Revelstoke, BC, which is a small town in British Columbia in the mountains, and famous for its ski hill and just stunning natural beauty.
Yeah, I've there was a Revelstoke Coffee in Concord, New Hampshire, where I just moved from.
Oh, wow.
And so I had never heard of Revelstoke until I went to the coffee shop, and it got me thinking, like, wow, that must be a really epic place if they name a coffee shop after it in America.
Yeah, that's pretty wild. And it is a pretty epic place. Yeah, it's grateful to be back here.
Yeah, I definitely want to get into your story of in your investment into cold therapy and what that's done for you. I know that's done a lot for you in many ways, even for your health, and we'll get into all that. But I really want to start with, which is what I do with most guests, is start with the story, because this podcast was started in many ways because I wanted to, not only learn from entrepreneurs, but also people who have been through stories of resilience. And I know yours is no exception. So I would love to hear, if you would, to tell us a little bit about how you became the Jeff you became today. And we can kind of pick apart some of the things I'm really curious about. And where would you like to start with that?
Yeah, well, I feel like we could fill up the whole episode with with what made Jeff who he is today, and there's a little snippet that I can give people that kind of gives people a snapshot of what I went through to become who I am right now, and why I do the work that I do in the world. And so I like to take people back to October 23rd, 2003. And I was looking at my body lying in the back of an ambulance, and I'm looking down at my body, and my body, the nurse in the back and the ambulance are completely covered in blood, and I'm drifting further and further away. And I hear a voice in my mind that says to me, you can go back. You can keep drifting off, but if you go back, there's going to be a lot of suffering. And yet there's a knowing inside me that I need to go back, that there's still something that I need to do with my life. And as soon as I make that decision, it's just boom, I'm instantly back in my body. I rip off the straps on the spine board. I rip off the hard collar, sit up and yell, "Take me back to the hospital." Because I knew I wasn't going to survive the transport to the ICU that was over 2 hours away. And so flash forward, I'm back living my life, and the injuries and the pain from the accident piled on top of a mountain of childhood trauma. So bad that I'm now on oxys, benzos, SSRIs, and I'm also partying and self-medicating with drugs and alcohol. So every morning I'm waking up and I'm slamming back a handful of pills with leftover booze from the night before, trying to chalk up a rail off the table with leftover cocaine. And I'm just completely lost and helpless at this point in my life. Like my relationships, my life are just completely a disaster. And I'm living this bad boy gangster lifestyle, and eventually I end up in Mexico, and I meet a man that works for the Sinaloa Cartel. And eventually I gave in to the invitations to start drug trafficking for them, and worked for the cartel, and eventually quit working for the cartel, and then got convinced to go back and do one last run. That was, of course, a setup. And so I get busted by the Mexican military, and I get thrown in jail for what threatens to be a 10 to 25-year sentence. And so the only thing I really care about at that point in my life are my dogs. And they're staying with a friend of mine while I'm locked in a concrete cell, and I've got 1 hour a week out in the yard where I can talk to people on the outside. And so one day I call up my friend Bibi, who's taking care of my dogs, and she picks up the phone, and says to me when she answers, she said, "Jeffrey, I'm so sorry. Carmen was killed by another dog's owner after they got in a fight." And so the guilt that I feel from leaving her behind and having lost the most important thing to me at that point in my life just feels devastating. And we get called back into line, filed back up into the cell, and I get squashed back in the 11-foot by 11-foot cell with 30 other men. And I'm sitting in the corner meditating for days on end and just trying to process this grief and losing the most important thing to me in my life. And all of a sudden I realize that I don't have to suffer anymore. Suffering is a choice. And I'm free. And 2 years after landing in that cell, I was released early by what we could call good luck. And in Spanish, they call it el favor de Dios. And so I come back to Canada and I'm able to pursue my dreams again. And so I start to travel the world and I get to learn from some of the best known names in breath and cold and plant medicine and trauma therapy. And I'm able to start to pick myself back up and start to follow that path of my dreams again. And now today, I hope people find that same freedom and really work with radical ownership, self-mastery, and really becoming conscious creators in our lives to really leave behind the pain and the trauma of the past and be able to step into a bright, beautiful future that I believe is available for all of us.
Yeah, thank you for that. That you definitely paint a picture that I want to dive into a little deeper. But before we even get to the part where you talk about the mix up with the cartel, I'm curious about Jeff as a child and a teenager, and what led you towards, you mentioned childhood trauma. What led you towards a life of addiction and numbing out? Like, how did that begin?
Yeah, I think the first place I numbed out was reading. I was a super studious child, and that was kind of my way of dissociating when I was young, was reading, researching. Being a really good student was a way of receiving validation. And yeah, there was, looking back for a long time, all I saw was the challenges in childhood and, just had kind of that very, very narrow, traumatized view of that part of my life. And at this point, I can look back and recognize that it was a much richer and nuanced childhood, in which a lot of really good things happened as well. But for a long time, the challenging ones overshadowed the good ones for a lot of my life. And so I went off to university on a scholarship to become a neurosurgeon, and had been valedictorian in my class and got away to university. And when I was free and kind of left to my own devices and, and kind of away from the situations that I'd found myself in as a child, and I'd started drinking in high school. And when I got to university, that just accelerated and, kind of took the typical progression of drinking marijuana and then got into psychedelics and really, even with the interest in being a neurosurgeon, which was kind of a lofty goal in the early 90s for a kid from Revelstoke, I had a really keen interest in consciousness and understanding the mind. And so I chose to take the path of psychedelics and direct experience. And I just really wasn't into staying in school, and really had a chip on my shoulder towards authority at that point. And really, I just wanted to party and to explore. And, I look back and think, I chose the hard way, and kind of did that intentionally. And I think some of us do that to learn through experience. And in the end, we sometimes end up at the same spot where it's kind of feel like I'm working a lot with people's minds and beliefs and thoughts and consciousness, but took a little bit different route than the traditional route to get here.
So I can relate to that. I at 18 went to college, and it was sort of like this, just so different from where I grew up, and ended up going into college in the forest. Grew up in a small city, and I kind of fell into the same thing. I fell into alcohol, cannabis, psychedelics, different things. No guidance. I didn't have any guide or mentor to guide me into good decisions. I just tried it myself, but I flunked out, and down the rabbit hole I went. And people who've listened to this podcast or know the past, they know my past. So I won't get into that, but I can relate. And it sounds like from there, how old were you when because I kind of want to hear the story of what happened right before you started running with the cartel. So can you just paint that picture, and then what made you make that decision to work with them?
Yeah. After I quit university, I came back to my hometown, and, and very quickly psychedelics transitioned into chemicals and cocaine and crystal meth and ecstasy, and, just kind of trying all these things out, and also working really hard, and really still being able to live, put it in air quotes for people who are listening, but a normal life, and worked hard and partied hard. But I had a number of near-death experiences through my 20s, and I was working in forestry at the time. And after one of those accidents, the one that I described in the story, and I got hooked on OxyContin. And, and I had been partying and self-medicating all the way along. I'd also been dabbling in the Western medical system and trying to get therapy and help, and wasn't really willing to accept that likely I had a huge role to play in the problems that I was experiencing. And, I wanted to blame everybody else. And so I didn't really want to go into what I was feeling, or, or really didn't feel like I had the tools or support to do that. And OxyContin came in, and that was just the best thing ever, because I didn't feel anything. And so lots of times I tell people that the first 2 years I was on OxyContin were 2 of the best years of my life, because I was just completely numb. And then, those claws of addiction really started to get their grip, and it started to become a real issue, and started to really see the other side of it. And so eventually, at that point, that was that first wave of OxyContin that rolled through, and, and I don't think the world was prepared for the devastation that was going to create in people's lives. And so, I was seeking help, and there was just nothing really available at that. So I decided to go off on my own, and, and also was on cocaine and SSRIs and benzos and all of these other things at the same time. And so, similar to, what you were saying earlier about starting psychedelics without a guide or a mentor, this was the cold turkey without any guidance, and it was pretty messy. But eventually, I did wean myself off of OxyContin eventually took off, left Revelstoke, made my way down through the States. Was still using a lot of cocaine that had turned into crack, eventually landed in Mazatlan. And when I'd been in the US, I'd bought a fifth wheel trailer and drove that trailer down to Mazatlan, parked in an RV park on the beach in Mazatlan. I pull in there in July. It's almost empty. There's no snowbirds there. There's only a couple of trailers in the RV park, and the one that I happen to park beside is owned by a guy that works for the Cartel. And so at that point, I really just wanted to get clean. I met him. We started chatting, went out for dinner, kind of got to be friends. And he always wanted me to go to work for him. And I was just trying to get clean, get my feet on the ground. I started practicing yoga. I opened up a restaurant, and I was just working my ass off to try and put my life back together. And eventually I ran out of money and started working for them. And, and worked for them on and off, ran the restaurant, kept teaching yoga, and was just kind of living this double life, and got to a point where I could quit. And I felt like I had my feet on the ground. I felt like I could keep moving forward. And so I stopped working for them. And, and then there was the offer for the one last run. And I couldn't refuse.
Yeah. Well, that makes me understand. And I can relate too about the cold turkey. I did the same thing when I had the revelation that there was a big problem. I didn't go to rehab. I didn't tell anyone what exactly had happened, how deep the addiction was. And I just tried to go at it by myself in the cold turkey route. And it was bad at the end. I mean, it was really bad. Heroin, Oxycontin, there was cocaine, there was a lot happening, but I went on my own too. And so I can relate to that. And that's a really scary world. And some people get out of it, some people don't. That's what I've learned over the last 20 years. And a lot of people find recovery on their own. Most people, I think it's over 90% of people, find a path that they define. And that path doesn't involve AA, doesn't involve it involves a path of discovery or self-discovery. And so you made it that far, but then money and not having resources, which, as you know, well, many people living in Mexico or even the United States, but especially Central America, there's a life that is nothing like we've experienced really in the States or even Canada, many of us, which is poverty. And like, you see people living a certain way, having money, and you're like, that's the way I want to go. I want to have resources, even for my family. And they choose to, work with the cartel or whatever maybe it could be the gang in a city or whatever. And they go that route. And I think it's really hard for people too to wrap their head around that decision when they didn't grow up that way, when their nervous system is completely hijacked from childhood trauma. And it's a much easier choice when you're in like destitute poverty, or like I said, your nervous system is out of whack and you need to survive, and survival kicks in.
Yeah, well, survival is, it runs deep, and, and we'll do whatever we need to do in order to do that. And when people don't feel like they have any options, then, then there is really no choice except to learn through that path. And we can only make different decisions when we expand our consciousness and recognize that they're available. But if we're not at that place of being able to see, then sometimes we got to go through these experiences ourselves in order to learn that, actually, I did make a decision that had potential consequences, and I don't want to live those consequences again. So I'll find different options, but especially for people living in Latin America or, other places in the world where, for me, my situation was a little bit different, but, a lot of the guys that I was in there with, they grow up in a poor village, in a shack of a home with dirt floors, and yet there's probably a TV there somewhere in the corner that's blaring rap music from the US, and they're watching these guys drive around in their fancy cars and got all their bling, and they're like, well, some guy in town, rolls through in a fancy car, and why wouldn't you make that decision? And, when there just doesn't seem to be any other options.
Yeah, it's certainly a complex issue. It's definitely not black and white. And hopefully people who have listened to the show and maybe done their own research and maybe have experienced it personally, that it's not a black and white issue. There's a lot of complexity to that. And, getting back to your story, when I hear your story, I don't mean to keep bringing up my story, but I don't hear a lot of stories like yours. And it makes me think of my fateful choice of ordering prescription medication one more time from Mexico. And that one last time, me doing that, where I was caught. And it completely transformed my life as you spending time in prison, which I didn't spend time in prison, fortunately. But, I did that one last order, that one last run before I was going to leave from New Hampshire to Florida to escape my addiction. And I was arrested by a federal agent. And that became a 10-month investigation, which I didn't know was happening when they let me go to Florida, and then came to get me. And so, and that was 22 years old. So how old were you when that happened, when you did that setup? Because mine was definitely a setup too. When you got set up and you were arrested, how old were you?
I was 35.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. I was in my late 20s when I had the accident that really led to the OxyContin. And then I was, in my late 20s, early 30s when I was really going through the depths of addiction and got myself cleaned up. And the one last time, it's a curious thing, and I'm sure probably you and I both have friends that, that didn't make it for that one last time, and people that get clean, and start to live, ordinary lives again. And, and just that one last time, what is that lure? Why do we make those decisions? And I look back and I don't have any regret about making that decision to do that one last run. And it's interesting to put myself back in that place because there was so much back and forth. Should I go? Should I not go? I'm not going. Okay, I'll go. And, and I just chalk it up again to level of consciousness. It's like we're just not quite there yet. And, maybe at that point I could see that there was another option. And yet the option that I took was the one that I knew. And so I think there's that patterning that, within our neurology, within our biology, that we choose the familiar. And it's an interesting thing to contemplate.
Yeah, I think that's really important about the level of consciousness, right? Like you only knew what was available for resources and what was possible in the world by your level of consciousness. How else would you have known? There wasn't a, chat GPT available to ask you how to live and should I work with the cartel or not? You had to go and you had to just see from your consciousness, right? And what's available to me. And made that choice. And then obviously you spent like a couple years in prison, and I'm sure you got a lot of stories from survival in prison that you could elaborate on. And I think I'm curious, like when you were in prison, when you think about who you are today, like what lessons did you pull out of the prison experience that informs you today with the people you help and yourself?
Interestingly, it taught me a lot about loving other people and being able to accept other people, because when you're crammed in a cell with 30 other people, our projections and that mirror is like right in front of your face all of the time. And so it was a real crash course in being able to see how what I was feeling towards other people was being projected directly back at me. And in such an extreme situation, where it's just so aggressive and just so much pain and suffering in that place, and so the reactions are extreme, and really just recognizing that I have to find a way to be able to accept these other people that I'm living with, and these aren't, for lack of a better word, normal people. These are hardened criminals, that are coming in from all walks of criminality, and so being able to accept those men for who they were and all the challenges that they had faced in their lives that had created the characters and the roles that they were playing in the world felt like almost insurmountably challenging. And yet there was a deep knowing that I had when I was in there that the only way I was going to get out without doing the 10 to 25 years was if I could learn to be okay with where I was at. I knew that I needed to be okay in order to be in a state where I could really focus on where I wanted to go and getting out. And so, yeah, there was a lot about learning to love other people. I learned a lot about what we were speaking to earlier in regards to poverty and just why people make decisions and how, different populations of people live in the world and their mindset, which was really fascinating. And then I feel like another huge piece was just, don't ever give up. And if we are able to focus our minds and do the things that we need to do and be able to really come to a place of self-mastery in our lives, really take radical ownership for the decisions that we've made that have led us to the situations we find ourselves in, then there truly is no limit to what we can create in our lives. And so it was a school of hard knocks in a lot of ways, but I felt like I learned a lot in my time there.
Yeah, so I'm curious about that makes a lot of sense. And obviously it was to the extreme, like literally the school of hard knocks. And I'm sure, well, let me ask you this, like you speak Spanish clearly. So did you know Spanish before you went to Mexico? Did you learn Spanish in Mexico?
I knew it. I had traveled to Mexico quite a few times before I drove down, so I spoke a tiny bit of Spanish. When I had the restaurant in Mazatlan, I learned a little bit more Spanish, but I was still getting by with very little. And so when I landed in prison, I didn't speak that much Spanish, and that led to a lot of miscommunication. So it became a high priority to learn Spanish.
Wow.
And yeah, and to be able to communicate. And I love speaking Spanish now. It became a real part of me in that experience. And I think when you are able to really deeply embody another language, it's like unlocking a different part of yourself. And so, yeah, I'm really grateful for that.
Yeah, now that I'm in Costa Rica and I've been here for long enough to realize how important it is for me to learn Spanish, I'm wondering, like, what's the best way to immerse myself in Spanish? I really don't want to go to prison, though, to learn it. I want to probably take maybe some lessons with Babbel, or maybe do like a Spanish camp. So I don't really want to follow your footsteps, Jeff. How you were forced to learn Spanish, but I agree. I'm really fascinated to enter the world of 600 million, 800 million people that know Spanish, and being able to enter a person's world on a daily basis. I have the opportunity, to conversate, and I know even probably less than you do. So yeah, it's language is powerful, right? Language to unlock this deep experience of someone else's culture and world that's so different from where you came from. And I'm sure you learned a lot just from conversating with people from Mexico, and just opening up that world that you cannot access without knowing the language.
I feel like, as we go through, I can't help but picking up on, a couple of really important parts that we're touching on here, one of them being the level of consciousness, and just recognizing that, from my perspective, that if there was to be an issue in the world, it would be the level of consciousness, and and the ways in which consciousness has really been restricted, and how when we elevate consciousness, the population at large, it has so much more available, and just the importance of language in our lives and the way that we speak, and to be able to dissect the ways that we communicate, both with our internal dialogue and our external, and just like how important these pieces are in really being able to not only create a better life for ourselves, but to radically shift the reality that we're living in. And I feel like these are just two such important pieces.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I see that through line coming through as well. And I'm wondering when I think about language, and not just learning a language as someone to conversate with someone, but the language of consciousness and speaking from that place, which is the work you do today, right? And the work you probably were investigating, even as a neurosurgeon. Such an interesting choice for for a major. But I'm wondering the language of consciousness, which you've explored, and I know that from the little time that we've known each other, I know that's a really important aspect of the work you do too. And I want to get into the breath work and all the other things you're doing, but when it comes to language and as it relates to consciousness, what language have you learned with studying astrology, human design, gene keys, all the things you've done? What do you think is what was the most important part of that language of consciousness that had the epiphany for you? Was that just through reading it, experiencing it? Was it some type of journey, adventure? But what really started to expand your level of consciousness to be able to open up to things like those languages, which astrology is a language, right? Human design, these things are different types of you could say, languages. So where was that part of your journey that opened you up to that type of language?
Yeah, it's a really great question, Jesse. And I feel like really I would give credit to my parents and traveling as a child. And, I grew up in a small town in BC, and kids didn't really travel very much in the 80s. And yet my parents took us to Mexico and the Dominican Republic, and we went to a few different places, and I feel like those experiences started to really open me up to see that the life that I had grown up with in that small town wasn't all that there was, and that there was different ways to live a life than what I was seeing at home, and had the opportunity to see people in poverty, had the opportunity to see very different landscapes and very different cultures. And so I feel like that was a real seed that was planted. And I always had a fascination with astronomy and cosmology and just wanting to learn all about the universe and all these different pieces. Then when I was in my 20s, and as I was going through that really challenging time with addiction, I was really curious about different religions, curious about spirituality. I traveled a lot on my own when I was in my late teens, early 20s, and went to different parts of the world and just learned about different cultures, and again just like expanded my perspective on ways that one can live within reality. And I think the more that happened, there was psychedelic use throughout that whole time too, and it was, I think just very early on I had a sense that there was more to life than what I was learning about in school. And that there was, I think that was what drew me on that path of just wanting to learn more about the mind and the brain. And I think it was really when yoga landed in my life, when I first got to Mazatlan, that I really became, a more dedicated student to learning about consciousness through those Eastern perspectives. And then, of course, with a Western mind, I couldn't help but to start to try and weave those two worlds together. And I think it's just been like a lifelong fascination and exploration.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That now I'm starting to get to know more about, your choices of where you are today and the work you do. It really makes a lot more sense to me, hearing your whole story and who you help today. And I'm curious about the breath work. So obviously at some stage of this journey, did you work directly with Wim Hof, or did you do training with him? Because at some stage you get into cold therapy and breath work. So where did that come in? You did psychedelics, you explored ancient wisdom traditions and religion, but when did the breath work come in, and then when did that become important?
It came in really early on. After I got landed in Mazatlan, I found yoga almost right away as I started to come out of addiction. Breath, obviously a huge part of yoga. I had really been struggling to breathe and really was struggling through those early years of yoga even. And looking back now and knowing what I know about breath, I understand it a lot better, but I wasn't really getting a lot of answers from people. Breath was a part of yoga and it was part of meditation, and I'm doing pranayama, but in terms of being able to breathe on a day-to-day basis and really be able to harness that power of the breath, it was a long journey and personal exploration of trying to research and understand what was going on in my own body. And after I got out of prison and came back to Canada, I started working as a paramedic. And so there's kind of like another tie back into that Western medical perspective. And as I was working as paramedic, I came across a podcast with Wim Hof, and I was working on an island off the west coast of British Columbia at that point. And so the water's freezing cold there all year round. And I was really struggling with allergies at that time. And I would just do anything to get rid of those allergies that are just driving me crazy. And so I watched this podcast with Tim Ferriss and Wim Hof, and thought, well, I'm going to start getting in the cold water, and I think from childhood experiences, there was a part of me that was deeply fearful of ever being seen in the world. And so even though I had been teaching yoga, I'd been in that role of teacher for a while, there was still a really deep fear of actually being seen in the world. And I felt like as I got into cold exposure and started to explore that as a modality and be able to meet my fear of the cold, which I was also deeply fearful of, it just radically changed my life and how I was able to show up in my life. And so, so along with the cold exposure came the breath work. I'd been doing breath work all along, and I just decided at that point I wanted to go all in on breath work and learn as much as I could about that one thing. And I think because of my own personal experience, I had a real drive to learn not just the techniques, but I'd learned so many techniques, and I learned from Wim, and I learned from different teachers, and conscious connected breathing, and Patrick McEwen, and all these different people were talking about the same thing. They're talking about it from different perspectives, but it still felt to me like there was something missing. Like there was just this thread that, just wasn't being woven through all of the different modalities. And so I just, went, nose into the books and researched and learned from all these different teachers that I'm super grateful for, but really wanted to get like a more holistic perspective on this whole world of breath work, but really to incorporate breathing, into that, like the day-to-day breathing that we're all doing all day long, that also provides, an incredible opportunity in every moment to meet life differently and to radically change our lives through having a deeper awareness of not just breath, but what's going on in our body, what's going on in our nervous system. How does that affect my breath? How does that affect my mind? How does that affect the choices I make or lack of making conscious decisions in our lives? So I just found the whole thing fascinating, and I'm still down that rabbit hole as I recreate one of the courses I created when I first started Breath Army.
Yeah, so I want to get into the breath work more, but before I got to go back to the cold, of course, because cold is a huge part of my story. So it's so fascinating about allergies. I have my own theories about what I healed with the cold, and they're probably pretty controversial, but at the same time, it was my own experience. And I'm so curious about your allergies because I just went back to the States about 10 days ago, and I've had chronic cat allergies for 30 years. And those allergies, right before I came to Costa Rica, I got allergy tested again because I wanted to make sure these are the allergies I actually have. I'm not like making this up. It's not like emotion stuck in my nervous system. Maybe it is, but it's also physical. And so I got tested. It was off the charts. And so I have been doing sauna cold plunge here about 4 days a week for, I don't know how many months, almost 8 months. And I obviously go in the ocean a lot, and I do earthing, and I do a lot of holistic practices. But the point is I went back and I didn't have the cat allergies anymore for the first time in 30 years. So it's almost unexplainable. My friend Pete has 5 cats. 2 of them were sleeping in the same bed as me. So I tested the theory. I tested to make sure that there was no cat allergies, and there wasn't. And so, and anyone who knows me, the cat allergies were so severe, would trigger chronic asthma. Like my breathing would shut down with cats. It wasn't just this like kind of a couple sniffles, It was like 100 sneezes, shut down the lungs. So what do you think was in the idea of even just the science of the brain and the body, how would the cold, and was it the cold combined with breath work, like how would that eliminate allergies and so what's your theory behind that?
My own personal theory is that for one, it has a huge amount to do with overall inflammatory load in the body, but also like general state of the nervous system. And if we're in a highly activated state all the time, then I believe that makes us more sensitive to these other allergens that come in. And as we decrease, the level of activation in our nervous system, then we also desensitize ourselves to these other stressors. And it just kind of like an interesting thing about the tissue of the nose and the sinuses is actually an erectile like tissue. And so when we're highly stressed or highly activated in our nervous systems, that tissue becomes inflamed, engorged with blood, and it becomes highly sensitive. And so I think both the breath work and the cold exposure were not only having an impact on my nervous system, but having a huge impact on overall inflammation within my body. And having had that experience similar to you, it's a lived experience. Nobody's going to take that away from you. And so the way that I operate in the world, just observing other people, and oftentimes when I observe other people that are highly sensitive, I can often create that link between, it kind of seems like this person is highly stressed or could benefit from practices to reduce inflammation. And there's a curiosity there whether that would support people in working with their sensitivities or allergies.
Yeah, that's really fascinating for sure. Like when you think of highly sensitive souls, also known as maybe empaths and whatever label we want to put on it, I wonder what the percentages of allergies there are. Like these are fascinating studies. I love to, and how it's linked to childhood trauma too. Be really fascinating to see that link. But that's the inflammatory response and cold and how that works on the body, and of course the adrenaline, norepinephrine, and these different cortisol response, all these positive stressor, and how that could impact. It's a really fascinating. It's so funny to me that wouldn't already be studied. That we have all these other studies, but we don't study like that. I wonder why? Because cold is free, and that's why. But moving on, the breath. So breath is something that I've explored. I have done different types of breath work. I've tried Wim Hof, and I've of course done yogic breath or pranayama and different types of breath, and even even breath through some of the trainings I have, which are not about breath, but I incorporate breath in like heart coherence or heart math practices that I've been trained in. But with you and Breath Army and what you're doing, you've been talking about earlier. You talked about how there's still something missing from what you were alluding to, and with what you do, are you filling the gap of what you think is missing, and what was missing from these other modalities of breath that you've incorporated in what you do?
Well, I think interestingly, the thing that was missing in and amongst all of the different types of breathing techniques was actual breathing, and really that's the thread that weaves all of these modalities together, but it also is the tool that people have available to them 24 hours a day. And so it's one thing to have a pranayama session and do some alternate nostril breathing, or to do some Wim Hof breath work, or we do some heart coherence breath work. And that's all great, and it will change our state. But what about in this moment, as we're sitting here having a conversation, to be able to recognize that the breath is like an anchor that is continually present in every moment of our experience. And it's one thing to have a big experience and recognize, oh my gosh, like I recognize now that, this thing happened when I was 3, and I, because of that, I started to do this. And, we start to unravel some of these big traumas, and that's great and powerful. It's kind of like doing psychedelic work. But to me, the real power of breathing is not necessarily just in those big experiences. It's in the moment to moment experience that provides us a tool to be able to integrate bigger insights into our life. And so for me, that was the piece that was missing. Is it's kind of like like the Wim Hof breathing. Those pieces are like the tip of the iceberg, really, in terms of what's really available and the potential that we have available to us in every single moment. And for me, it's about really being able to meet triggers that present themselves in the moment. When I was young, I was so high strung, and so unable to be in any type of intimate relationship without just having anger and rage explode. I had no tools to be able to deal with my emotions. And so to be able to have a tool and a way to create more presence and more awareness and be able to unravel these patterns and do that deep healing in real time, to me is invaluable. And there's just so much potential there for people.
Yeah, give me an example of breath that would be something right now during this podcast interview that you would be doing, or someone could try if they're listening to this episode and they're going, I have no idea what the hell he's talking about, but I do want to know, how could I, in the present moment, it's kind of like the power of now, being in the present, and how am I breathing right now in this moment? And what would you recommend? What would be some of the techniques that you could do to bring it into the everyday moments?
Well, for me, even before we start to think about manipulating the breath in any way, for me, the foundation of all of this work is awareness. And so for that, we're really utilizing breath as a tool to bring us into presence. And so as we have this conversation, I'm continually checking in and feeling my breath flowing in and out of my body. I'm observing the way that my body might be holding my breath back, where I might be restricting my breath, or I might be kind of holding my breath a little bit. All of those things would be cues to me that my nervous system is activating. It's sensing a threat when there's actually no threat. We're just sitting here having a conversation. But through having the presence created by the breath, I can notice, like my right leg is a little bit tense right now. And it's like, well, why is my right leg tense? We're just sitting here having a conversation. And so it's a tool that brings us into presence, where we can start to notice these other signals from the body. We can start to observe this process of the breathing, and even without needing to do a technique, really just observing, are you holding yourself back from receiving the breath? Is there tension in your body? Is there restriction in your body that's preventing you just from allowing the breath to flow in? And then oftentimes people are holding the breath back, or they're really controlling the exhalation. So people push it out, or they force it out, or people are over breathing way more than the actual demands of the body. So we just start to watch the breath, and the breath is like a signature. It's like it tells the story of the way that we live. The way we breathe is the way we live. So just start paying more attention to the way that you're breathing. In general, for people, we can kind of soften the breath. We can slow it down a little bit. We can often bring it deeper into the body and start to learn a little bit about the mechanics of the way that we breathe. And it's the most important thing that we do. If we don't breathe, we're not here for very long. And so learning how to breathe more optimally, to me, is just like a no-brainer. It's such low-hanging fruit for people just to have a basic understanding of how to do the most important thing we do.
Yeah, you make it sound really, really important and really simple at the same time. And I don't think that's thought of, in the world we live in. It's like, I got to get from A to B as quickly as possible. And if I can't get to A to B, then in the middle of it, I'll distract myself with caffeine and Instagram and addictions and all these things. And, but in between all that, every moment is the breath. And we're not paying attention to the breath. I think I saw a reel that you had that was, I don't have time for breathing. I don't have time for breath work. And it's like, well, actually, all you do is breathe. And so, yeah, I think it's so fascinating. And I think mindfulness practices and yoga and the things you're talking about obviously help with regulating the breath. If your nervous system is completely out of whack because of, not only what you're putting into your body, which could be many different things, but could be to the held stored emotions of unprocessed trauma and different injuries you received along the way that were emotional, maybe physical. It's easier said than done, right? To start to develop a practice of being in the moment and breathing and then feeling something in my left ankle or feeling something in my back or in my neck. And for me, what I've done a lot, and this took a lot of meditation to understand that I was doing this, what I do a lot is I hold my breath and I don't even realize it. So I'll be with someone, especially someone who's higher energy, and I'll start to hold my breath, almost waiting for my response or something. So what do you think that is caused from someone who holds their breath and, sort of waits for, I don't know exactly. I mean, I could allude and give you anecdotal evidence of why I believe it, but what do you think is someone who kind of holds their breath and their day-to-day life and experiences?
First, I want to go back to the easier said than done. And I don't know if that's true. I feel like it's actually a really easy thing to do. And, and in this situation of holding the breath, to me that may indicate that, that this high energy person is coming into your experience, and that person might not be safe. And so probably at some point in your life, you may have learned that if things aren't safe, I'm just going to kind of hold my breath and I'm going to make my own energy really small and just kind of see how this unfolds until I feel like there's a moment where I can actually relax and let it all go and feel that sense of safety. So for me, it may likely have something to do with just feeling unsafe in that high energy. And I think, well, maybe, do you have anything to respond to that before?
Well, one of the things that I know that has been part of my story is making myself smaller. And I think that would make sense with holding the breath. It's like, that's a way to make myself smaller. So I almost disappear. And the person can get their emotions regulated. They can get their needs met. They can use the juicy energy to regulate their self. And I think that's part of the role that I had to play as a child and the environment I grew up in. So, and hence why I became a therapist. Hence why I became all these things, right? It's not because I'm like, this is my way. When I was a child, I'm gonna go through all this shit, and I'm gonna choose to still be here and serve others. No. Right. It's, so I think the holding of the breath is, that makes a lot of sense. That would be a way for me to make myself smaller. And it's something I had to do growing up. And it's something that I find myself still doing today. And it's something that I work on. it's something that I don't do as like to blow my ego up to make myself bigger either. It's like kind of basic needs being met that I didn't even understand were basic needs. And so, yeah, that would make sense that the breath holding would be something related to making me small.
100% makes sense. And, and it's so common. And I might find myself doing the same thing. And, and it's only through, having awareness as you do now at this point to be able to notice what we're doing. And I think where it really takes my mind is, is to around the concept of when we learn to tap into that power of our breath, that really is freedom. The name of the revision that I'm doing to the course that I'm working on right now, it's the fourth time I've done this course, and it's called Free to Breathe. And really recognizing that freedom starts in our breath, and our ability when that really high energy person comes in the room, or maybe it's a really angry person, maybe it's a really sad person, to be able to maintain our own sovereignty in that moment and to maintain our own connection to our own lived experience and to be able to maintain a certain energetic state within ourselves regardless of what's unfolding around us really is to be a sovereign being and to really claim our freedom in our life. I think there's a huge liberation that people can find when they learn to deepen that connection.
Yeah, it's got me really being reignited into paying more attention to the breath and being conscious of the moment by moment of the breath, which can be so challenging. You just have so many things.
There's so many things these days
that get in the way of being mindful of the breath. And so I'm curious with, your course and what you're doing. So what is this? Is this like a live course on Zoom that you do with a group of people that you teach, or is it one-on-one? Like, how does the course unfold and how long is it and what does it involve?
Yeah, this one's called the Breathwork and Nervous System Blueprint. And first time I ran it was in 2020. And so this is the fourth version. It's live online. And so there's content labs and then also live kind of hot seat coaching calls. And then there's also some mentorship available within that container through people who have gone through the year-long training that I've done as well. Will be in the container doing some mentoring as well. So people have somebody to check in with their questions and really guide them through that process. So I'm pretty excited about this new version. It's been a few years since I've updated it. And as you know, life is moving quickly these days. And so we learn a lot in a few years, and excited to take everything I've learned and really recreate just kind of from the point that I'm at to my life right now and offer that into the world. So feeling pretty stoked about that.
Yeah. When does that begin? When does the course begin?
Starts on October 21st, and just putting the finishing touches on the landing page. So that'll be up on the website likely by the time that this episode comes out. And yeah, just really highly encourage people to reach out, check in, see if it's a good fit for them. They can find all the little content bits on all the social media and all the different locations. But yeah, always encourage people to reach out and ask questions if they have any through social media platforms, email, website. And always happy to connect with new people and share the power and potential that's available for people.
Yeah, it was certainly great to get through parts of your story to get to the breath, which breath, like you said, breath is freedom. And having that experience with you today on the show to, just arc the journey right into the breath. I think the work that you have done in yourself is self-evident, because even talking with you, I found I slowed down a lot. Like I just slowed myself way down to match your energy. And then I found myself being really present of the breath, really present of any type of uncomfortability in the way I was sitting or, and then adjusting accordingly, and just, so that's a testament to, I would say, your lifelong journey of work and what you've done and, people you've trained in the courses. So I'm excited to continue getting to know you better, learn more about the breath, learn more about your course. And definitely, I'm glad there's time for people to sign up. It's only August. So we'll make sure we get this episode out and you're ready to promote the landing page. And my episodes come out fast though, so you're gonna have to get that.
Well, that's a good kick in the pants to make sure I get it done. But it might be really enjoyable. It's been really nice chatting with you, Jesse, and really appreciate the conversation and appreciate anybody who's still here listening and good times and likewise look forward to deepening the connection over time.
Yeah, for sure. We'll do another one in the future. We'll check in and hear everything's unfolding and the new research. And yeah, there's just a lot of synergy between our stories too. And it's really cool to go to those places that I often forget and I'm reminded from a story like yours. And so, yeah, where can people find you? Where can they work with you and get to know your work?
Yeah, breatharmy.com is best place to go. Breath Army, Instagram, Facebook, all the channels. But the website's got links to everywhere. So it's a good place to start.
Amazing. Well, Jeff, great conversation. Grateful to have you on. And thanks again, my friend, for coming on the show today.
Yeah, my pleasure, Jesse. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you for checking out Entrepreneurs in Recovery podcast. We are so appreciative that you are here. Make sure you go ahead and like and subscribe to the show on YouTube. Leave a review on iTunes and Spotify so more people can find the show. Once again, thank you so much. We have great episodes and content come out in the future. Thank you for being here. Have a blessed day.